The ship was dying. Captain Aara stood in the center of the command bridge of the research vessel Gentle Whisper, watching as the lights flickered and failed one by one. Emergency power was holding, but only just. The red emergency lamps bathed everything in a sickly blood-red hue, making her pale blue skin appear almost violet. Her forearms hung at her sides, two of them trembling. She convinced herself it was the cold. The heating systems had failed 20 minutes ago, and the temperature inside the ship was plummeting. But it wasn't the cold. Through the observation window, she could see them. 14 ships, arranged in a loose circle around her crippled vessel like predators circling wounded prey. They were grass ships, ugly, brutal creations of dark metal and sharp angles. They were covered in spikes and sensor arrays that resembled insect eyes. Each of them was at least 3 times the size of the Gentle Whisper. The massive flagship in the center of the formation was 10 times larger. Its name, roughly translated into Galactic Common, was Collector's Prize. The Grash were slavers. Everyone in the galaxy knew it. They raided the fringes of civilized space, snatching whoever they could and selling them on markets that officially did not exist. They were strong, fast, and covered in natural armor-thick plates of chitin that could stop low-power energy discharges. They stood 8 feet tall on average and possessed 6 limbs, with faceted eyes capable of seeing in near-total darkness. By any reasonable metric, they were monsters. They had found the Gentle Whisper alone in the void, unarmed, unescorted, and with no way to flee. Aara closed her large dark eyes and inhaled slowly. She was a scientist. Her entire career had been dedicated to studying deep space organisms in the frigid reaches between star systems. She had never fired a weapon. She had never participated in a fight. On this ship, she had 43 crew members, and every one of them was looking at her right now, waiting for her to do something, say something, fix something. She had nothing. The Grash had attacked 6 hours ago, dropping out of hyperspace in a flash of warped reality and opening fire immediately. Not to destroy. The shots were precise, surgical. They aimed first for the hyperdrive, then the main engines, then the long-range communication array. The Gentle Whisper was not a warship. It had no shields worth mentioning. The shots tore through the hull like talons through paper. 3 crew members died in the first 30 seconds, sucked into the vacuum through hull breaches before the emergency bulkheads could seal. After that, the Grash simply waited. They sent a single message in broken Galactic Common. The message was simple. Stop. Wait. We come. Take. Fight. All die. Do not fight. Some survive. Choose. Aara chose to wait. Not because she was a coward, but because she had 40 crew members left. To fight the Grash on a research vessel wasn't a battle. It was suicide. So she waited, thought, and tried to find a way out. There was no way out. Captain. A voice came from behind her. It was quiet, frightened, and cracked on the second syllable. Aara turned and saw Sulit, her youngest communications officer, standing by the ruined comms station. Sulit was barely an adult by Wylan standards, thin, with wide eyes that were now even wider, and trembling hands moving over the broken console. The communication array is destroyed, Aara said. She tried to keep her voice level, though she didn't quite succeed. You cannot send a message through the main array. You cannot, Sulit said, but the secondary reserve emergency pulse transmitter it runs on a separate power line. The Grash hit the main antenna, but the pulse transmitter uses a different system. It is usually short range, but if I reroute power from the life support reserves and dump it all through the transmitter simultaneously, I can send one wideband pulse, one message in all directions. How far will the power last? How far will it reach? Sulit hesitated. Maybe 40 light-years, maybe more. It depends on how much power I can pull. 40 light-years in the vast emptiness of the Karad expanse. It was simultaneously a great deal and nothing at all. The space was a region between 3 major galactic territories, unclaimed, uncontrolled, and mostly empty. That was why the Gentle Whisper had been there. The deep space organisms Aara studied thrived in such places, away from the noise and energy of civilization. That was why the Grash hunted there. No laws, no patrols, no witnesses. But 40 light-years could reach the edge of someone's territory. They could reach a relay station, a patrol ship, an observation post. They could reach someone who could help. Do it, Aara said. Sulit nodded and went to work. Her hands stopped trembling as she focused on the task. This was what she was good at. Machines, signals, the language of electrons and waves. The world outside was horrific, but the world inside the console made sense. She rerouted power lines, bypassed damaged circuits, and assembled connections that no engineering manual would have approved. It took her 20 minutes. When she finished, she looked at Aara. "I need you to record the message, Captain. I can only send it once. After that, the transmitter will burn out." Aara nodded. She straightened, lifted her chin, and addressed the recorder in Galactic Common. She gave the ship's name, their species, their coordinates, and the nature of their situation. She described the strength of the Grash 14 heavily armed ships. She described the damage to her vessel. She described the 3 lost crew members and the 40 remaining alive. And then, at the end, she added something that was not tactical, not strategic, useless in any practical sense. She added a plea to whoever might hear it. "We are captured. We cannot fight. We cannot flee. We are scientists, not soldiers. There are 40 of us left alive. Please, if anyone is listening, please answer." Sulit sent the message. The transmitter shrieked with power for exactly 1.4 seconds. It pushed the signal out as a sphere of electromagnetic energy, expanding at the speed of light in all directions. Then the transmitter died, just as Sulit had predicted. Its circuits melted and fused. The message was gone. It was out there, racing through the void, and there was nothing more to do but wait. They didn't have to wait long. 2 hours after the signal was sent, the Grash boarding parties arrived. They came on armored shuttles that attached to the hull of the Gentle Whisper like parasites, slicing through the outer skin with plasma cutters. The Wyland crew didn't hear them coming, only the screech of tearing metal, and they gathered in the main cargo bay as Aara had ordered. There was nowhere to hide, and fighting was pointless. The best they could hope for was to stay together and survive. The first Grash to enter the door was enormous. It had to stoop to fit through the opening, and even then, its shoulder plates scraped the sides. It was covered head to toe in dark, ribbed chitin and carried a weapon that looked like it had been created to kill creatures much larger than the Wylands. Behind it followed others. 10, 20, 30 Grash warriors filled the cargo bay with the sounds of their clicking mandibles and the heavy thud of their armored feet. And behind them all came Scatheus. Scatheus the Collector was not the largest Grash in the room, but he was undoubtedly the most terrifying. He moved with a slow, confident ease that spoke of absolute authority. His chitin was darker than the others, almost black, and covered in scars he wore like decorations. His faceted eyes swept the room, assessing the huddled Wyland crew with the calm calculation of a merchant inspecting inventory. He stopped in front of Aara. She forced herself to look at him. He was nearly 3 times her height. "Captain," Scatheus said. His galactic common was better than the message had suggested. "Much better. You are the leader of these creatures." "I am. Then you understand what is going to happen now." "I understand what you want to happen," Aara said. Her voice was steady now. Something in the realization of the worst she could imagine had burned away her trembling. "I do not agree." Scatheus made a sound that might have been a laugh. It sounded like grinding stones. "Agreement is not required. You are cargo now. All of you. Wylands get a good price. You are small. You are obedient. You have 4 arms for work. Very popular with buyers." He turned and gestured to his warriors. "Begin sorting. Healthy in the first group, injured in the second. Dead weight, leave." The Grash moved among the Wyland crew. Like farmers sorting cattle, they grabbed crew members by the arms, inspected their teeth, and checked the flexibility of their limbs. Those who resisted were struck not hard enough to cause permanent damage, because damaged goods were worth less, but hard enough to make it clear that resistance was futile. Aara was grabbed, inspected, and thrown to the floor. When she tried to pull away, a boot pressed into her back, pinning her to the cold deck. She lay with her cheek pressed against the metal floor, staring at the wall, thinking of the signal she had sent and wondering if anyone had heard it, and if so, if anyone cared. Far the signal traveled. It reached the conclave of enlightened worlds first, a coalition of over 200 species that considered themselves the moral and intellectual center of galactic civilization. The conclave possessed the largest fleet in the quadrant, the most advanced technology, and a bureaucracy so vast it had its own gravitational pull. The signal was received by an observation post on the edge of conclave space. The operator on duty logged it, tagged it, and forwarded it to the Regional Emergency Response Coordinator. The coordinator reviewed it and forwarded it to the Central Committee for Emergency Assistance. The committee held a meeting. The meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end of the meeting, a subcommittee was formed to consider the jurisdictional implications of intervening in unclaimed territory. The subcommittee was given a deadline of 10 standard days to provide a report. Within 6 hours of receiving the signal, the conclave had logged it, discussed it, shelved it, and forgotten it. No ships were sent. No rescue operation was planned. The Karad expanse was outside their territory, and intervening would set a precedent that might obligate them to interfere in future incidents. A cost-benefit analysis did not support action. The signal reached the Talarian hegemony next. The Talar are a species of tall, thin beings with silvery skin and a culture built entirely on trade, profit, and economic calculation. They operated the largest commercial network in the galaxy. They weren't cruel. They simply viewed everything, including life, through the lens of value. A Talarian intelligence analyst reviewed the distress signal and prepared a brief report for the hegemony's Strategic Trade Council. The report included an evaluation of the military costs of a rescue operation, the economic value of the Wyland research crew, and the potential diplomatic benefits of intervention. The numbers did not add up. A rescue would cost more than the Wylands, and the Wylands had nothing of significant trade value to offer in return. The hegemony sent an official diplomatic message to the Wyland government expressing deep concern for the safety of their citizens and offering assistance in negotiating their release through the appropriate diplomatic channels. Everyone who read the message understood what it really meant. The Tilar would not come. The signal was received by the Rotan collection. The Rotans are an insectoid hive acting on pure collective logic. They assessed the signal, determined that the Wylands were not members of their collective and therefore were not their responsibility. They did not respond. They did not even acknowledge receipt. The signal reached other civilizations: the Dotani, the Pali, the Yungtha, the Arvani Federation, the Malari Republic. 27 species in total received the distress signal from the Gentle Whisper. 27 species heard a ship of scientists begging for their lives. 27 species did the math, checked their rules, consulted their lawyers, weighed the costs and risks, and decided, each for their own reasons, that it was not their problem. When none of them responded, the signal continued its journey. It grew weaker as it traveled. The energy thinned as it expanded through the vast void of space. By the time it reached the outer limit of its range, it was barely more than a whisper, a faint, distorted fragment of data that most receivers would have discarded as background noise. But on the edge of a young race's territory was an observation post. A small automated relay station tethered to an asteroid, bristling with antenna arrays and powered by a compact fusion reactor. The station was not elegant or advanced by galactic standards. In fact, it was rather crude, held together by visible seams, covered in warning labels in a language that no other species in the galaxy could read, and running on software that updated far more often than its hardware. The station's designation was Outpost Echo 7. It belonged to the United Earth Fleet. The signal arrived at Echo 7 at 04:47 station time. The automated systems almost discarded it. The signal was weak, fragmented, and encoded in a format that did not match the station's native software. But the UEF had learned in its relatively short time among the stars that signals from unknown sources in empty space were worth paying attention to. A subroutine tagged the transmission, ran it through a translation algorithm, and forwarded the decrypted result to the nearest human facility. That facility was the anchor station Thermopylae. Humans named their stations after battles. To other species, this seemed unsettling. Humans didn't seem to understand why. On Thermopylae, the signal landed on the desk of Communications Technician Officer 3rd Class Reefs. Reefs read the decrypted message once, then read it again. Then she picked up the internal comms and called the duty commander. "Ma'am," she said, her voice steady and professional, the way military personnel are trained to be when they are trying very hard not to feel what they are feeling. "You need to see this." The duty commander that night was Commander Lena Vasquez. Vasquez was 43. She had short black hair and an expression that most species in the galaxy would describe as terrifying. She had served in the United Earth Fleet for 22 years. She had participated in the border wars, the Kepler Station incident, the Battle of Tate, which humans still didn't like to talk about. She was good at her job. She was tired. She had half finished a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been recycled from engine coolant, which, considering the state of the water filters on Thermopylae, was not entirely impossible. She read the signal, read it again. She set down her coffee. "Reefs," she said. "What is the verification of the source?" "Origin matches the Karad expanse, ma'am. Coordinates coincide." Identification of species. There are no hostile research species in our database. Signal encoding matches emergency communication protocols. And the aggressors are Grash, ma'am. Based on the description, 14 ships, slaver configuration. The room went very quiet. Everyone on Thermopylae knew what the Grash were. Every human serving in this part of space knew what the Grash were. 2 years ago, the Grash had captured the Stellan Hope, a colonial transport carrying 216 civilians, including 47 children. By the time the UEF responded, the ship was an empty shell drifting in space. The colonists were gone. Every single one. According to intelligence, they had been sold into slavery in a dozen different markets in the galactic underground. 47 children had disappeared. The UEF had never found them. It was an open wound that never healed. A quiet fury that lived in the bones of every sailor and marine serving on the frontier. That was why Order 71 existed. Vasquez stared at the signal for a long time, then looked up. "Connect me to the Fleet Operations Department," she said, "and wake up Colonel Chen. Or tell him his Marines have work to do." She picked up her coffee again, took a sip, and looked out the window at the stars. Somewhere out there, 40 scientists were waiting for someone to come. Vasquez intended to be the one who came. The Wylans had sent their distress signal to the galaxy and pleaded for help from anyone who would listen. They hoped for the Conclave with its massive fleets and noble ideals. They hoped for the Talar with their endless resources. They hoped that any of the great, ancient, civilized powers of the galaxy would hear their cry and answer. Instead, their signal reached the humans, a species that had been in space for just under 2 centuries, a species the majority of the galaxy considered dangerous, unpredictable, and slightly insane, a species that came from a world so hostile that the Galactic Biological Service had classified it as a Category 12 death world, a planet where everything, including the weather, the wildlife, the geology, and other humans, was constantly trying to kill you. A species that, in its short and turbulent history among the stars, had acquired a reputation for one very specific thing. When humans heard someone screaming for help, they rushed to assist and did not stop until the screaming stopped. The Wylans didn't know this yet. They would. Commander Lena Vasquez hadn't slept in 19 hours, and she was going to be awake for a long time yet. That was normal. She had gone without sleep for longer and for worse reasons before. At least this time, she wasn't trying to hold a damaged ship together with emergency patches and willpower. This time, she was doing something she understood. She was building a fist. The operations center of Anchor Station Thermopylae was a large room buried in the heart of the station behind layers of armor and blast doors. It was not a beautiful room. It had bare metal walls, harsh white lighting, and rows of workstations covered in screens and holographic displays. It smelled of recycled air, old coffee, and stress. This was a room where decisions were made that determined whether people would live or die. And it looked the part. Vasquez stood at the central planning table, a large, flat holographic display that showed a 3-dimensional map of the local sector. The Karad expanse was marked in gray, a vast, empty region between 3 colored territories. The last known coordinates of the Gentle Whisper were marked with a red dot. The Grash fleet, based on signal data, was marked with 14 smaller red dots surrounding it. She looked at the map and calculated in her mind. "Distance to target is approximately 18 light-years," said Commander Lieutenant Okafor, her tactical officer, a tall man with a shaved head and a voice like gravel falling into a bucket. "At maximum hyperspace drive, our fastest ships can cover that in about 36 hours. The heavier ships, the cruiser and the medical ship, will take closer to 42. "That is too long," Vasquez said. "The Grash won't sit still. If they finish sorting the captives, they will split the fleet and scatter to different markets. Once they scatter, we will never find them all." "Agreed, ma'am. But physics does not care about our schedule." "Physics never cares." Vasquez leaned over the table and studied the map. "How quickly can we get a significant force to these coordinates?" Okafor checked his tablet. "If we send the destroyers ahead at maximum speed and the cruiser and support ships follow them, the destroyers will be there in 34 hours. The rest of the battle group will arrive 6 to 8 hours later. Destroyers alone against 14 Grash warships. Not ideal, ma'am, not ideal." "That's a polite way of saying suicide, Okafor." "Yes, ma'am." Vasquez straightened and crossed her arms. She was not a tall woman, 5'6", compact, with a build that suggested she had spent a lot of time engaging in physical activity in uncomfortable places. But she had a presence that filled rooms. When she looked at someone, they felt it. Good, she said. Let's talk about what we have. They had the designated Quick Response Group of Anchor Station Thermopylae, a small but capable set of warships kept in a state of readiness for exactly these situations. The UEF had learned after the Stellan Hope that keeping forces ready for immediate deployment was not an option. It was survival. Vasquez opened the fleet list. The flagship was the UEF Achilles, a Prometheus-class heavy cruiser. It was 240 meters long. It was armored like a fortress and carried enough firepower to turn a small moon into dust. It wasn't fast, it wasn't elegant, and it wasn't stealthy. It was a hammer, and it was very good at being a hammer. Its captain was Commander David Park, a quiet, cautious man who possessed the unusual talent of being both extremely careful and extremely aggressive depending on the situation. Next were 3 Wolfpack-class destroyers, UEF Morning's Fang, UEF Iron Promise, and UEF Razor's Edge. They were small, fast, and vicious. Where the Achilles was a hammer, the Wolfpacks were knives. They were created for one purpose: to get close to enemy ships and tear them apart. Each carried a crew of 60 and enough weapons to fight opponents 5 times their size. Their captains were young, aggressive, and slightly insane, exactly the type who volunteered to command a Wolfpack. Then there was the UEF Silent Retribution, a Spectre-class electronic warfare frigate. Silent Retribution was the strangest ship in the group. It carried almost no conventional weapons. Instead, it was stuffed with the most advanced electronic warfare systems in the UEF fleet: jammers, simulators, signal suppressors, sensor ghosts, and a dozen other systems whose exact capabilities were classified much higher than Vasquez's salary. Its task was not to fight. Its task was to ensure the enemy could not fight. Its captain was Commander Lieutenant Yukita Tanaka, a small, quiet woman who smiled a lot and whose service record had several completely blacked-out sections. Finally, there was the UEF Mercy's Hand, a Hospitaller-class medical and rescue ship. It was the largest ship in the group by volume, but it carried no weapons. Instead, it carried 6 surgical theaters, 200 medical beds, a full xenobiology lab, and a crew including some of the best doctors, trauma surgeons, and field medics in human space. Its commander was Captain Sarah Okoye, a former field surgeon who had once performed an emergency amputation on a Marine during combat while the ship she was on was under enemy fire. She hadn't stopped cutting. And then there were the Hell Divers, an assault company of Marines Hell Divers, officially designated as 3-to-1 Quick Response Company. First, Marine Expeditionary Regiment, 200 heavily armored stormtroopers under the command of Colonel James Chen. They were the ones who went in when the ships finished shooting and the real work began. Each Marine wore a suit of powered exoskeleton armor that turned a human already one of the most dangerous predators ever to evolve on any known planet into something most species in the galaxy would classify as a natural disaster. Colonel Chen was in the operations center now, standing next to Vasquez and studying the tactical display with the calm, focused expression of a man who was very well versed in violence and had long ago come to terms with that fact. He was over 50. He was fit, stern, with gray hair cropped short and hands covered in scars. He had been a Marine for 30 years. He had fought on more worlds than he could easily count. 14 ships, he said, staring at the display. Any data on the crew count? Based on known Grash Force compositions, each ship carries 40 to 80 warriors. The command ship could have up to 200. Total estimated enemy strength, 800 to 1,200 Grash, Okafor said. Against 200 Marines, Chen didn't sound worried. He sounded as if he were calculating. Your Marines won't be fighting all of them, Vasquez said. The fleet will handle the space combat. Your mission is boarding. Capture the ship with the captives. We need these people alive. The colonel understood. Chen stared at the display for another minute, then nodded slowly. We have trained for this. The armor gives us an advantage in close-quarters combat. Grash are strong, but they aren't fast, and they don't adapt well to changing situations. If we can get onto their ship before they organize proper defenses, we can tear them apart room by room. Can your people handle the insertion? Vasquez asked. Chen almost smiled. Almost. Commander, my people were landing on enemy ships and hostile planets before the Grash knew we existed. We can handle the insertion. The insertion was the hallmark of the Hell Divers, and it was what made every other species in the galaxy look at humans with a mix of awe and terror. Instead of docking with a target ship or using shuttles like civilized species, the Helldivers launched themselves at the target in individual landing pods. Each pod was barely large enough for one armored Marine. They were launched from the carrier ship like projectiles, accelerated to high speeds, and slammed into the hull of the target vessel. The pods had hardened tips capable of piercing most ship armor, and every Marine carried a plasma cutter to slice through whatever the pod couldn't break. By any reasonable metric, it was insanity. The pods had minimal shielding, minimal guidance, and a margin of error measured in centimeters. A pod that hit at the wrong angle would bounce and send the Marine spinning into space. A pod that hit a reinforced section would crumple and kill its occupant. A pod that hit too close to a reactor or fuel line would explode. Humans did it anyway. They calculated the risks, decided they were acceptable, and then trained until the fatality rate dropped to what they considered manageable. The rest of the galaxy called it recklessness. Humans called it Tuesday. Vasquez authorized the deployment according to Order 71. And that order had been created specifically for situations like this. Confirmed human trafficking against sentient beings. It gave field commanders the authority to act without receiving approval from Earth or an admiral. Bureaucrats and politicians had argued about it for months before it was signed. The military had pushed for it with a single voice. The Stellan Hope had made the argument for them. The official name was Order for Immediate Action Against Confirmed Hostile Slaver Elements. Its unofficial name, which every sailor and Marine knew, was simply the Promise. The promise that what happened to the Stellan Hope would never happen again. The promise that the next time someone screamed for help, the answer would not be silence. Within 90 minutes of Vasquez reading the distress signal, the battle group was moving. The Achilles was the first to undock from Thermopylae. Its massive engines glowed blue-white. As it moved away from the station and oriented itself toward the Karad expanse, the 3 Wolfpack destroyers followed, forming a loose, triangular formation around the cruiser. Silent Retribution slipped away last from the main group, nearly invisible against the stars, moving dark and silent as always. Mercy's hand brought up the rear. Its white hull was marked with the red cross that humans use to designate medical ships, a symbol that most alien species didn't understand but had learned to associate with humans who wouldn't shoot you. On the Achilles, Commander Park stood on the bridge and reviewed the tactical plan for the 3rd time. He was a cautious man. He didn't like surprises. The plan was straightforward, as the best plans usually are. Silent Retribution would arrive first, using its stealth systems to approach the Grash formation undetected. It would map the enemy's positions, identify the ship carrying the captives, and prepare its electronic warfare systems. When the main force arrived, Retribution would blind the Grash fleet, jamming their sensors, blocking their communications, scrambling their targeting systems, and the Achilles and the Wolfpacks would do the rest. Simple, clean, brutal. Park liked simple plans. Complicated plans had too many places where things could go wrong, and things always went wrong. The key was to make the plan simple enough that when things went wrong, and they would, the people executing the plan could adapt without losing the thread. On the morning's Fang, the lead Wolfpack, Commander Lieutenant Aisha Roman stood on her cramped bridge and watched the stars streak past as the ship drove its hyperdrive to the limit. Roman was 31 years old. She was the youngest Wolfpack commander in the fleet, and she had a reputation as a pilot who flew her ship the way a motorcyclist rode through traffic fast, close, and with a carefree disregard for standard rules of engagement. She loved her ship. She loved her crew and hated slavers with a fury she kept behind a professional smile and precise tactical commands. She had been part of the response team that found the Stellan Hope, walking through the empty corridors of the colonial transport and seeing what the Grash had left. Personal items scattered on the deck, children's shoes, scratches on the cargo bay walls where people had tried to get out. She hadn't slept well since. On Silent Retribution, Commander Lieutenant Tanaka sat in her darkened operations center, surrounded by screens displaying data streams and signal analysis, and planned how to make 14 Grash ships dumb, mute, and blind simultaneously. She was very good at it. Her ship was designed for it, and she had spent years perfecting the art of electronic warfare, the art of penetrating an enemy's technology and turning it against them. And in the landing bay of the Achilles, 200 Marines were checking their armor, testing their weapons, and preparing their landing pods. The bay was noisy, the clatter of metal, the hiss of airtight seals, the low murmur of conversation. The Marines were professionals. They didn't waste energy on bravado or speeches. They checked their gear, reviewed their assignments, and ensured the person next to them was ready. But Staff Sergeant Coffee Asante sat on a bench next to his landing pod and stripped his rifle for the fourth time. It was a nervous habit, and he knew it was a nervous habit, and he didn't care. The repetitive motion calmed his hands and focused his mind. He was 36. He was born in the Aara region on a planet most galactic species would refuse to land on if they understood how dangerous it was. He had been a Marine for 14 years. He had a wife named Adoa and a son named Kwame, who was 7. When the Stellan Hope was captured, 47 of the missing colonists were children. 7 of them were the same age as Kwame. Asante finished assembling the rifle, locked the bolt, and set it aside. He opened the mission briefing on his helmet display and read it again. Boarding. Rescue hostages. 40 Wyland captives held on Grash slaver ship. Rules of engagement. Lethal force authorized against all hostile combatants. Priority 1. Bring the captives back alive. He closed the display and looked at his fellow Marines. They were quiet, focused, ready. Some of them were writing messages to their loved ones, which was a tradition before every major operation. Some were praying, some were just sitting still with their eyes closed, running the mission through their minds. None of them hesitated when the orders came. None of them asked why they were risking their lives for a species they had never met in a part of space that wasn't their territory. For people who hadn't specifically asked for human help, the question didn't even arise. Someone was in trouble, someone asked for help. That was enough. 40 light-years away, on hundreds of different worlds, the great civilizations of the galaxy went about their business. The Conclave subcommittee was still debating. The Talar were re-editing their diplomatic message for proper formatting. The Rotans had already deleted the signal from their records. 27 species, representing trillions of sentient beings, went about their business without a thought for the 40 scientists slowly dying in the Karad expanse. None of them knew what was coming. None of them understood what they had done. With their silence, they had created a vacuum, an empty space where help should have been, but wasn't. And nature, as humans like to say, abhors a vacuum. Something always rushed in to fill it. In this case, what rushed in was 5 human warships carrying over 1,000 sailors, soldiers, and doctors, all traveling at faster-than-light speed toward a collision that no one had sanctioned them to make and no one could stop them from reaching. The galactic community had been given a test, and they had failed it. They had heard a cry for help and turned away. They had done the reasonable thing, the practical thing, the thing that made sense when weighing costs against benefits. Humans hadn't done the reasonable thing. Humans rarely did. They heard a cry and rushed to help, not stopping to calculate if it was worth the trouble. It was, depending on your point of view, either humanity's greatest flaw or its greatest strength. The galaxy was about to find out. And in the darkness of the Achilles Bridge, Commander Parks stared at the stars ahead and counted the hours until arrival in the Karad expanse. Behind him, the crew worked with quiet efficiency, conducting system checks and preparing for battle. The ship hummed with the deep, steady vibration of engines running at maximum power. Park thought of the signal. He thought of the Wyland captain's voice, not speaking in neat galactic common, asking anyone at all, to help. He thought of how that voice must have sounded in the dark, knowing the odds of anyone hearing it were almost zero and sending it anyway, because what else could she do? What else was left when everything else was lost but to reach into the void and hope someone was listening? He thought of the Stellan Hope. He thought of the 47 children. He thought of the promise that every UEF human had made, spoken or unspoken. After that day, never again. The fleet flew on through the dark. 72 hours had passed since the Gentle Whisper had been captured, and Captain Aara was learning what it meant to be cargo. The Grash had moved most of the Gentle Whisper's crew to Scatheus's command ship, the Collector's Prize. The containment zone was deep in the belly of the ship, a large, cold room with metal walls, metal floor, and metal ceiling, lit by a single strip of dim yellow light that ran along one wall. The air smelled wrong. It smelled of a harsh chemical odor reminiscent of industrial cleaners mixed with something organic and rotten. Since the temperature was set for the comfort of the Grash, which meant it was too high for the Wylands, some of her crew had already begun to show signs of heat stress, dull eyes, dry skin, shallow breathing. There were 37 of them left. 3 had died in the initial attack. 3 had been taken during the sorting and hadn't returned. Aara didn't know where they were. She tried not to think about it. She didn't succeed. Her face ached. One of the Grash warriors had struck her during the sorting when she stepped between him and Sulit. The blow was casual, almost lazy, a flick of a hand that was thicker than Aara's entire body. It had knocked her off her feet and sent her sliding across the deck. Her left cheekbone was cracked. She could feel it creak when she moved her jaw. One of her 4 eyes on that side was swollen and shut. The tissue around it was dark, purple, and edematous. She had stood up. The Grash seemed surprised by this. Not impressed. The Grash were incapable of being impressed by anything a Wyland did, but surprised, as one might be surprised if a piece of furniture suddenly moved on its own. Aara had stood up, moved back between the warrior and Sulit, and stared at the massive creature with her 3 remaining functional eyes. The warrior looked at her for a moment. Its mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Then it moved to the next crew member. It wasn't mercy. It was indifference. She wasn't worth the effort to strike twice. Now Aara sat with her back to the wall of the containment zone, with Sulit huddled against her side. She counted her people and tried to hold on. Sulit hadn't spoken a word since the boarding. The young comms officer sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, staring at nothing. Her eyes were open but empty, as if she had gone somewhere inside herself where the Grash couldn't reach her. Aara recognized that look. She had seen it in scientific papers on PTSD. She never expected to see it on someone she knew. "Sulit," she said quietly. "Can you hear me?" Sulit's eyes focused on Aara, very slowly. She didn't speak but nodded. It was little. It was something. "I need you to stay with me," Aara said. "You can do that." Another nod. "Good. That is good." Aara wrapped the girl in one of her arms and held her. "We sent a signal. Someone might have heard it. We have to stay alive long enough for help to arrive." Even as she said it, she didn't believe it. She had studied galactic politics enough to know how the great powers acted. The Conclave would form a committee. The Talar would calculate the costs. The other species would turn away. No one would come. She was lying to Sulit. And Sulit probably knew she was lying, and yet she did it, because a lie was all she had left. Above them, on the bridge of the Collector's prize, Scaithius the Collector was in a great mood. He stood in the center of his bridge, in a large, dimly lit space filled with the clicking, chirping sounds of Grash officers at their stations, reviewing inventory on a holographic display. 40 Wyland captives, 37 alive. 3 had been too badly damaged during the boarding and had been disposed of. The remaining 3, who had been separated during the sorting, were being held in another section of the ship. They were young, healthy, and would bring a premium price at the markets on the station Corex. The total estimated value of the cargo was approximately 400 galactic trade units. Not his best haul, but decent. Wylands were always in demand. Their small size made them easy to control. Their 4 arms made them useful for delicate labor, and their gentle, submissive nature made them popular among buyers who didn't want trouble from hardier species. Scaithius was satisfied. The operation had gone exactly to plan. His scouts had identified the Gentle Whisper 3 days before the attack, tracked it into deep space, and waited until it was far from any possible help before striking. The ship had been ridiculously easy to disable. No weapons, no shields, no escort. Scientists they never learned. His only slight concern was the wide-band pulse the Wylands had managed to send before the jammers fully activated. His communications officer had detected it. One powerful pulse lasting less than 2 seconds. It was a distress signal. Obviously, Scaithius wasn't worried about it. Space was vast and empty. Even if the signal reached someone, the response time of any major galactic power would be measured in weeks, not days. By then, Scaithius and his fleet would be long gone. The Wylands would be sold and scattered across a dozen markets. He had done this many times before. The galaxy was full of weak species that ventured into dangerous places without protection, and it was full of powerful species that were too comfortable, too bureaucratic, or too indifferent to stop people like Scaithius. It was, he mused, a very profitable arrangement. He was thinking about prices, whether to sell the Wylands as a lot or individually, whether to hold some for a private auction on Carex, when his sensor officer interrupted him. "Commander, long-range sensors have picked up an anomaly." Scaithius turned his heavy head toward the sensor post. What anomaly? Hyperspace signature. Small, very weak, at extreme sensor range. Identification is impossible at this distance. It could be a merchant ship, a probe, or a natural phenomenon. The signature is unusual. It does not match any known hyperspace drive profile in our database. Scaithius pondered for a moment. An unknown hyperspace signature in the middle of the Karad expanse was slightly unusual, but not alarming. Ships occasionally passed through space. Merchants who wanted to avoid tariffs, smugglers, other raiders, none of them would challenge a fleet of 14 Grash warships. And if it was a patrol of one of the major powers, unlikely given the unclaimed status of the space, Scythius had backup plans for that too. His fleet could scatter and regroup in a dozen different places. "Track it," he said. "Report any changes." "Yes, Commander." Scythius returned to his inventory calculations and thought no more about it. He should have. The anomaly his sensors had barely detected was the UEF silent retribution, and it was much, much closer than his instrument suggested. Commander Lieutenant Yukita Tanaka sat in the operations center of the retribution and watched the Grash fleet only through passive sensors. Her ship was operating entirely in dark mode. No active sensors, no emissions, no signals. The Retribution's stealth systems absorbed or deflected every form of energy the Grash sensors could detect, making the ship visible, at best, as a faint, anomalous object that could easily be dismissed as background noise. Tanaka had arrived 12 hours before the main battle group. The Retribution was fast when she needed it to be, and stealth ships didn't need to move in formation. She had dropped out of hyperspace at extreme range, shut down the engines, and drifted on minimal thrust, using the natural motion of space debris and stellar wind to mask her approach. It had taken her 10 hours to close the distance, but now she was approximately 200 kilometers behind the Grash formation, sitting in the sensor shadow of a small asteroid, and she saw everything. 14 ships. Exactly as described in the distress signal, the command ship Collector's Prize was in the center, by far the largest vessel. The other 13 ships were arranged in a loose sphere around it, a defensive formation the Grash used when they were stationary and not expecting trouble. The Gentle Whisper was there too, attached to one of the smaller Grash ships by docking clamps, slowly being stripped of everything of value. Tanaka had already identified the ship carrying most of the captives, the prize itself. Her passive sensors had detected life signs of the Wylans concentrated in the lower decks of the command ship. Additional life signs, 3, maybe 4, were detected on a smaller ship on the far side of the formation. She had mapped the Grash communications network. Every ship in the formation was connected by the standard Grash protocol, a mesh providing redundancy and resilience. If one node failed, the others would compensate. It was a good system. Against most opponents, it would have been difficult to jam effectively. Tanaka had spent 2 years developing countermeasures specifically for this system. She knew every frequency it used, every handshake protocol, every fallback mode. She had built algorithms that could mimic the network's own error correction signals, thereby feeding false data into the mesh, which would cause the entire network to collapse from within, as if the body were attacking its own immune system. She had also mapped the Grash sensor systems. Each ship had a primary sensor array and a secondary one. The primary ones were powerful but relied on active scanning. They sent out energy pulses and read the returns. The secondary ones were passive, designed to detect emissions and energy signatures. Tanaka's plan was to overwhelm the active systems with a stream of false returns, simultaneously blinding the passive systems with a directed pulse of electromagnetic noise across all frequencies the Grash could detect. The result would be a total sensor blackout. Every Grash ship would simultaneously lose the ability to see, hear, or communicate. They would float in the dark, blind and unable to coordinate their actions, target, or do anything but panic. And then the rest of the fleet would arrive. Tanaka checked the countdown on her display. The main battle group was 4 hours away. She sank into her chair, watched the Grash fleet drift in peaceful ignorance, and waited. 4 hours passed. At 06:00 local time in the Karad Expanse, the Achilles and its escort dropped out of hyperspace on the edge of the battle zone, approximately 50 kilometers from the Grash formation. At this distance, even Grash sensors would detect them within minutes. On the bridge of the Achilles, Commander Park watched the holographic tactical display update in real time as data from the silent retribution arrived via narrow-beam laser communication, which the Grash could not detect. This way, he could see every enemy ship, every defensive position, every weakness Tanaka had identified over the last 12 hours. "All ships, report readiness," Park said. The responses arrived quickly, clearly, and professionally. "Morning's Fang ready. Iron Promise ready. Razor's Edge ready. Silent Retribution on position. EW package loaded and ready. Mercy's Hand waiting at a safe distance. Helldivers loaded and locked. 200 Marines in the tubes. Ready at your word?" came Colonel Chen's voice from the landing bay. Park nodded to himself. He opened the all-fleet channel, then switched to the wideband channel, the one the Grash would hear. "This is Commander Park, Battle Group Achilles of the United Earth Fleet. We are broadcasting on an open frequency to all Grash ships in the Carrot Expanse. I am authorized to deliver the following message." He paused, not for dramatic effect, though there was an effect. He paused because he wanted to ensure every word was clear. "You are holding sentient beings against their will. This is a violation of the Universal Charter of Rights and the United Earth Fleet's Code of Conduct. You will immediately release all captives. You will disable all weapons systems. You will be prepared for boarding for inspection. You have 15 minutes to comply. This is your only warning. There will not be a second." He closed the channel and leaned back in his chair. On the Collector's Prize, the message came like a thunderclap. Scathia stood on his bridge and listened to the words of the human with a mix of amusement and contempt. He opened his sensor display and studied the contacts. 5 ships. 5 small ships against his 14. The largest one, the one that called itself Achilles, was significant but not overwhelming. The others were tiny. And there was something else on the edge of his sensors, a faint ghost that might have been a 6th ship. But it kept flickering, appearing and disappearing from the detection field. Probably a sensor error. 5 ships. Scathia laughed, and the sound filled the bridge, a harsh, grinding sound that made his officers look up from their stations. "Humans," he said. "I have heard of them. Deathworlders, aggressive, stupid." He turned to his communications officer. "Send a reply. 1 word." The word he sent was an obscenity from Grash combat jargon. Roughly translated, it suggested the humans should perform an anatomically impossible act and then get out before Scathia decided to add them to his inventory. On the Achilles, Park read the translated reply, nodded once, and glanced at the countdown timer he had started when he delivered the ultimatum. 14 minutes, 12 seconds remaining. "He thinks we're bluffing," said Okafor of the tactical post. "He will learn," Park said. The minutes passed slowly. On the Grash ships, warriors moved to battle stations with the careless confidence of a force that outnumbered its opponent nearly 3-1. Weapons systems powered up, shield generators hummed. Scathia arranged his fleet in an offensive formation, a wedge shape designed to concentrate firepower on the largest enemy ship and destroy it quickly to break the human formation. It was solid tactic against any of the great powers of the galaxy. It would have been effective. The Conclave fought in orderly lines. The Tillar fought in geometric formations. Every major species in the galaxy fought according to doctrines that were hundreds or thousands of years old, honed and polished to elegance, efficiency, and predictability. Humans had been fighting in space for less than 200 years. Their doctrine wasn't elegant, it wasn't polished, it wasn't predictable. It was built on one principle humans had learned on their home planet over thousands of years of mutual destruction in every environment their planet could offer. The enemy's plan is only a problem if the enemy can execute it. At 14 minutes and 47 seconds, Tanaka pressed the button. On every electronic warfare system of silent retribution, they fired simultaneously. The Grash communication mesh received a flood of false handshake signals that cascaded through the network, forcing every node to reject data from all other nodes. The network collapsed into itself in less than 3 seconds. 14 ships simultaneously lost the ability to speak to each other. At the same time, Retribution's EW arrays struck all Grash sensor systems, primary and secondary, with a focused pulse of electromagnetic energy tuned precisely to the frequencies on which those sensors operated. The active scanners received a wall of false returns so dense that their processors couldn't separate real data from the trash. Passive sensors were flooded with noise across all bands they could detect. The Grash fleet went blind, deaf, and mute. On the bridge of the Collector's Prize, every screen went dark or filled with static. The holographic tactical display dissolved into noise. Officers shouted in confusion. Their mandibles clicked in a fast, intermittent pattern indicating alarm. Scathia roared, demanding a status report, and received nothing but chaos. Exactly at 15:00, the Achilles fired its main batteries. The first volley struck the lead ship of the Grash Wedge, a heavy raider that had positioned itself for the first strike against the human cruiser. The shot hit the front of the ship with the force of a small earthquake. The Grash ship's shields held for approximately 1.5 seconds. The second volley pierced the unprotected hull and blew up the forward ordnance magazine. The ship disintegrated into a silent, expanding cloud of fire and debris. The battle had begun, and the Grash, blind, deaf, and cut off from each other, were not ready for what happened next. The three Wolfpack destroyers, Morning's Fang, Iron Promise, and Razor's Edge, hit the Grash formation at full speed from three different sides. They didn't slow down. They didn't maintain formation. They dove into the enemy formation like wolves into a herd of prey. Each chose a target and closed to maximum distance before opening fire. Morning's Fang, under the command of Roman, raced between two Grash raiders so close that its hull scraped against the debris from the explosion of the first ship. Her close-range weapons, intended for shooting down missiles, had been repurposed for close-quarters combat, releasing streams of tungsten slugs into the weak spots of the Grash ship at a distance measured in meters, not kilometers. At such a distance, even Grash armor couldn't hold. The Grash tried to fight back. Individual ships, disconnected from the networked fleet, tried to attack independently, but without sensors, they fired blindly and without coordination. They couldn't coordinate their actions. A Grash ship that turned to attack Iron Promise exposed its flank to Razor's Edge. A ship that tried to run ended up right in the Achilles firing solution. This wasn't a battle, it was a hunt. In 11 minutes, 7 Grash ships were destroyed or disabled. The remaining 7, those that still had functional engines, broke formation and scattered in different directions at maximum speed. On another day, Park might have pursued them. Today, he had other priorities. One ship didn't run. The Collector's prize hung in the center of the debris field. Its engines had been damaged by the first volleys of the Achilles. Its sensors were still distorted by Tanaka's jamming. It was trying to spin up its hyperdrive. The energy signature was unmistakable, a rising wail of power, meaning the ship was preparing to jump. Tanaka didn't allow it. A single, precisely aimed pulse beam from Silent Retribution struck the prize's hyperdrive array and disabled it. The energy signature vanished. The ship went dead. Scatheus's ship was trapped, and inside it, 37 Wyland captives were still alive. On the Achilles, Park opened the channel to the landing bay. Colonel Chen, the target is disabled and stationary. You are cleared for insertion. Landing bay. Launch. Colonel Chen gave one order. 200 landing pods flew out of the Achilles in a wave-like stream. Each carried one armored marine. Each was aimed at the hull of the Collector's prize. They crossed the distance in seconds, a cloud of iron rain falling on the crippled Grash ship. The Grash saw their approach on the few manual surveillance systems they had left. They saw 200 small objects approaching at high speed, getting closer, getting larger, and perhaps for the first time, realized they had made a terrible mistake. They had engaged the Deathworlders, and the Deathworlders had come. The first landing pod slammed into the hull of the Collector's prize at a speed of 400 meters per second. Staff Sergeant Coffee Asante felt the impact through every bone in his body, even through the powered exoskeleton armor that wrapped him like a second skin. The tip of the pod, a cone of hardened tungsten alloy designed for piercing ship armor, slammed into the outer hull, cracked it, and punched through. The inner hull stopped the pod, but barely. The pod was driven into the ship like a nail into wood, half inside and half outside, surrounded by twisted metal and sparking wires. Asante's training kicked in before his consciousness could react. He pressed the emergency release. The pod opened like a pea pod, and he sprang out boots on the inner surface of the hull, rifle raised, scanning the immediate environment through the helmet display. The display colored the world in green and gray hues, highlighting structural elements, heat signatures, and potential threats. He was in a corridor where the lights had failed. The EW had disabled most of the ship's secondary systems along with the primary ones. Emergency lighting cast dim red puddles every few meters, leaving long stretches of darkness between them. The air was thick and hot, filled with a sharp chemical odor that his suit's sensors identified as the Grash's preferred atmosphere. Smoke swirled from somewhere deeper in the ship, likely from fires caused by battle damage. His radio crackled. The shortwave tactical network was active. The Marines were using a system operating on frequencies that the Grash jammers couldn't touch, encrypted with protocols that would have taken a supercomputer years to crack. Third Squad. Report, Asante said. Asante, Pod 2. I am here. This was Corporal Diaz, his second. Pod 3. Here, small hull breach near my entry. Sealed with foam. Private Okonkwo. Pod 4. Here. I am on the deck above you, Sergeant. I see a stairwell. Private First Class Leo. 4 for 4. Asante checked the tactical display on his helmet. Across the ship, other squads were reporting their status. Of the 200 Marines who started, 187 had successfully inserted. 8 pods hit reinforced sections and failed to punch through. 3 hit at the wrong angle and deflected. 2 weren't responding, which meant the Marines inside were either dead or their comms were damaged. 187 Marines inside a ship with an estimated 800 to 1,000 Grash warriors. The math wasn't in their favor. However, math was rarely on their side, and the Marines had something the Grash didn't. Powered exoskeleton armor, night vision, thermal imaging, coordinated communications, and 2 years of cold, patient anger. Colonel Chen's voice came over the command channel. Calm and level as always. All squads. This is Helldiver Alpha. Situation update. Target ship is disabled. Primary and secondary power are down. Grash are running on emergency systems. They have no sensors, no comms, and no lights except for the emergency strips. We have total tactical advantage. Priority 1. Main containment zone. Deck 7, central section. That is where most of the captives are. All squads move to this position. Secondary objective. 3 to 4 additional captives are held on the upper decks of the ship. Squads Alpha and Bravo, take care of this. Everyone else, move to Deck 7. Watch your targets. Captives. Wylands. Small. 4 arms. Blue skin. Do not shoot the blue people. Chen finished, and Asante almost smiled at the last phrase. Almost. 3rd squad with me, he said. We're going down. They moved. Moving through the innards of a Grash warship was like moving inside a giant insect. The corridors were built for creatures 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, so there was enough room for armored humans. But the architecture was wrong in ways that were hard to describe. The walls were curved and ribbed, covered in a material like dried resin. The floors were textured with small ridges and grooves that the Grash used for traction with their clawed feet. The air tasted wrong even through the suit filters. Everything was built on a scale and in a style that, on a deep level, suggested to the human brain that this place wasn't meant for them. Asante's squad moved in a diamond formation. Asante in the lead, Diaz and Okonkwo on the flanks. Leo covered the rear. They communicated via gestures and short tactical messages over the radio. Their boots barely made a sound on the resin floor. The suit's noise cancellation systems absorbed the impact of every step. In the darkness, in their black armor and closed helmets, they were shadows, heavily armed shadows. They encountered the first Grash in 30 seconds. A warrior came around a corner 10 meters ahead, moving fast, with weapons in 2 of its 6 limbs. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall. Its chitin plates shimmered dimly in the emergency lighting. Its faceted eyes caught the weak light and reflected it in thousands of tiny dots, like a cluster of stars. The Grash saw them for a moment. Maybe a full second, it froze. It had never seen anything like the figures standing in its corridor. They were the wrong shape, the wrong size, and moved with a fluid, alien grace that had no place on a ship. They looked like something from a nightmare, dark, faceless, armored, with weapons glowing dimly in the red light. The Grash raised its weapon. Asante shot it twice in the center of mass. The tungsten, high-velocity armor-piercing rounds punched through the titanium armor plate and embedded themselves in the body beneath it. The Grash staggered, took a step back, and started to raise the weapon again. Asante shot it a 3rd time in the head. It fell. Asante stepped over the body and continued moving. Behind him, his squad followed without slowing their pace. There was no hesitation, horror, or triumph. It was just a job. The Grash had been between them and the captives. Now it wasn't. They reached the stairwell, a wide, spiral ramp designed for Grash feet, and began to descend. The deeper they penetrated the ship, the hotter it got, and the thicker the air. The ship's life support systems were struggling to maintain the Grash's preferred conditions on emergency power, which meant the lower decks were turning into a sauna. Inside the armor, the cooling systems hummed louder, keeping the Marines at a comfortable temperature. Grash working without their own ship's full life support system would be uncomfortable and sluggish, another small advantage. On the deck above, Squad Alpha encountered a group of 6 Grash warriors who had organized a defensive line across a wide corridor. The Grash had used cargo containers and construction debris to build a rough barricade, and they crouched behind it with weapons ready. Their faceted eyes scanned the darkness. It was a reasonable defensive position against most boarding groups in the galaxy. It would have held. The commander of Alpha Assault Squad saw the barricade on the thermal imager before the Grash saw him. He reported the position. Sergeant Torres, the Alpha Squad leader, assessed the situation in 3 seconds. "Stun grenades, too. Then move," she said. 2 grenades flew over the barricade and exploded one after the other. They were designed for use against species with faceted eyes. The flash wasn't a single pulse, but a rapid stroboscopic pattern that overloaded the multifaceted visual processing. The Grash behind the barricade recoiled, their mandibles opened, claws scratched at their eyes, and the sound component hit a frequency range that disrupted the vestibular organs, making them stagger. Squad Alpha climbed over the barricade before the last echo of the grenades died out. 6 Grash, disoriented and half-blind, against 8 armored humans moving with practiced coordination. It ended in 4 seconds. Across the ship, similar engagements were playing out in every corridor, every compartment, every stairwell. The Grash fought. They weren't cowards, whatever else was said about them. They were warriors, and they didn't surrender easily. They fought with weapons, claws, and their own bodies. A Grash warrior rushed at Private Hicks from 7th Squad, hitting him at full speed, and the impact threw the Marine back against the wall so hard it dented the backplate of his armor. Hicks stood up, shot the Grash 4 times, and continued moving. He would have a sore back for weeks. He wouldn't mention it. But the Grash were fighting blind, deaf, and without coordination. Each group of warriors was isolated, unable to communicate with others, unable to know where the attackers were until they appeared in the corridor like ghosts. The humans, conversely, were a single organism. Every squad was connected. All information was shared. Every movement was coordinated through the tactical network. When a group of Grash was discovered, nearby squads could converge on it from multiple directions, surrounding and suppressing the defenders before they could get organized. It was a system humans had been perfecting since they left their planet. Small groups of highly trained specialists connected by communication technology, acting independently but thinking collectively. They had used it in their world wars, their urban combat, their counter-terrorism operations, their peacekeeping missions. They had perfected it over centuries of conflict against the most dangerous predator they had ever encountered. Each other. The Grash had never encountered anything like it. On Deck 7, Asante's squad reached the main containment area. The door was sealed. A heavy blast door designed to contain cargo. The Grash had locked the captives inside, probably as a precaution when the attack began. Asante inspected the door and found the locking mechanism a simple system of magnetic latches powered by the ship's emergency network. "Leo, cut the power to this door," he said. Leo pulled a small device from her belt, a portable induction cutter, and applied it to the wall beside the doorframe, above where the power cable ran behind the wall. She activated it. The cutter hummed, and the metal wall glowed orange as the power cable behind it melted. The magnetic latch lost power and released. The door slid open. The room behind it was large and dark. The emergency lighting provided a weak red glow that barely reached the center. The air was thick with heat and the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. In the dim light, Asante could see the Wylands, dozens of them. Small blue-skinned figures huddled in groups, pressed against the walls, clinging to each other. They were thin, dehydrated. Some of them were clearly wounded. Their large, dark eyes reflected the red emergency light and the weak sheen of Asante's armor systems. When the door opened, they flinched, all of them, simultaneously. A wave of fear that ran through the room like a ripple. Some of them sobbed. A few pressed harder against the walls as if trying to crawl through the metal and disappear. They thought the Grash had returned. Asante stopped in the doorway. He looked at a room full of terrified people who had no reason to believe that anything coming through that door had come to help them. He realized how he must look to them. A tall, dark figure in full armor, faceless behind a closed helmet, carrying a weapon, emerging from the darkness. He didn't look like a savior. He did something that was not in any tactical manual. He lowered his rifle, clipped it to the magnetic mount on his back, and raised his empty hands, both palms forward, a universal gesture of harmlessness that evolution had somehow programmed into species across the galaxy. And then he dropped to his knees. He knelt on the deck of the Grash ship, lowering himself to their level, making himself smaller, less threatening, and reached up and pressed the release button on his helmet. The seal hissed. He took the helmet off and held it under one arm. His face was exposed. Dark brown skin, shaved head, wide brown eyes that were soft and kind. Despite the lines of fatigue around them, a thin scar across his jaw from an old injury. He was breathing the grash air, now hot, chemical, unpleasant, and he didn't flinch. He looked across the room and found the only Wyland who was looking at him without trembling. She sat against the far wall. Her face was swollen and bruised. One eye was shut. 4 arms protectively held a smaller Wyland next to her, despite everything. Injuries, fear, exhaustion. In her remaining eyes was something Asante recognized. It was the look of someone who was still fighting, even when there was nothing left to fight with. "Captain?" he said. His galactic common was accented but neat. He had studied the language during transit, practicing phrases he thought he might need. "Captain, my name is Coffee. I am a sergeant in the United Earth Fleet Marine Corps. You sent a signal. We heard you. We are here to take you home. You are safe now." For a long minute, nothing happened. The room was quiet except for the hum of the emergency systems and the distant, muffled sounds of battle deeper in the ship, where other Marine squads were still clearing Grash resistance. Then Captain Aara made a sound. At first, it was a quiet, low, trembling exhale that could have been a sigh or a laugh or the start of a scream. It grew slowly, rising from somewhere deep in her chest, and when it finally broke, it was neither. It was a sob, one ragged sob that contained 72 hours of fear, pain, despair, and the sudden, all-consuming realization that it was over. She cried, and next to her, Sulit cried. And then others, one by one, throughout the room, the crew of the Gentle Whisper began to cry. Deep, trembling tears of people who had lost hope and then, against all logic, found it again. Asante remained in place, on his knees, with his hands open and his face exposed. He didn't rush them. He didn't shout orders or rush them to stand. He waited because he understood that these people needed a moment to feel safe, a moment to stop being cargo and become human again. And that moment was more important than any tactical schedule. Behind him, his squad stood in the corridor and guarded the door with weapons ready, facing outward. They heard the crying through the open door. None of them spoke. Private Leo blinked rapidly several times behind her helmet visor and was glad no one could see her face. After a minute, maybe 2, Aara pulled herself together. She wiped her eyes with 2 of her 4 arms, took a trembling breath and looked at Asante. "How?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse and broken. "How are you here?" "We sent the signal to everyone. No one answered." "We answered," Asante said simply. "But you are the—" She struggled for the word. "You are the Death Worlders, the prohibited species. The galactic databases say you are dangerous." Asante looked at her for a moment, then smiled. It was a warm, tired smile that reached his eyes and softened his entire face. "Yes," he said. "We are, but not to you. Never to you." He slowly stood up and offered his hand. "You can go, Captain. We have a medical ship on standby. Our doctors are ready for your crew." Aara looked at his hand. It was large, dark, calloused, and scarred. A warrior's hand offered with tenderness. She extended one of her arms and took it. His fingers closed around hers with careful, precise pressure firm enough to support, gentle enough not to cause pain. She felt the strength in that hand. It was enormous strength that could break bones, and he held it as if she were made of glass. He helped her up. Next to her, Sulit stood on her own, wiping away tears, and looked at the armored figure with an expression of bewildered wonder. "Let's go," Asante said. "Let's get out of here." He put his helmet back on, grabbed his rifle, and led the Wyland crew out of the containment zone. His squad formed around them, 2 Marines in front, 2 behind, the Wylands in the center. They moved through the corridors of the Grash ship, past the bodies of fallen warriors, past scorch marks and hull breaches, and the evidence of the battle that had raged in the ship's arteries. The Wylands didn't look at the fallen Grash as they passed. These were the creatures that had terrorized them, beaten them, sorted them like animals. And now they lay still and silent, defeated by the humans walking beside them. The Wylands didn't look at their saviors, dark, armored figures moving with fluid, light confidence through a ship full of dead monsters, and tried to understand what kind of species could do this. What kind of world had produced humans who could fight like that and then drop to their knees and speak softly to strangers in a dark room? They didn't understand. Not yet. But they would. The rest of the ship was being cleared. Other squads had taken additional sections, and the sounds of battle grew quieter as Grash resistance collapsed. Some Grash warriors surrendered, dropped their weapons, and lay flat on the deck in a gesture of submission. They were bound and left under guard. Others fought to the end and were neutralized accordingly. On the upper decks, squads Alpha and Bravo found the three separately held Wyland captives. They were in a small room prepared for special handling, a term Asante didn't want to think about too carefully. The three Wylands were not frightened but alive and unharmed, except for psychological damage. The Alpha Squad medic gave them water and wrapped them in thermal blankets, and they were escorted to the rest of the crew. The boarding operation lasted 47 minutes. From the moment the first pod hit to the neutralization of the last Grash resistance, 187 Marines had boarded the ship. 184 came out. 3 Marines died, 2 from Grash weapon fire in close combat, and 1 when a section of the ceiling collapsed on her during a firefight. 11 Marines were wounded, 2 of them seriously. 40 Wylands had been captured. 37 were returned alive. 3 had died at the hands of the Grash before the humans arrived. Their names were Por, Vashan, and Tok. Aara would carry those names for the rest of her life. Mercy's hand had moved into position next to the collector's prize, extending docking tubes for the transfer of the rescued crew. Captain Sarah Okoye and her medical teams were ready. They had spent the entire transit studying Wyland physiology, preparing treatment protocols, and tuning their equipment for patients with 4 arms, different blood chemistry, and different bone structure. The Wylands were brought onto Mercy's hand, one by one, carefully, gently. Each was met by a human medic who spoke to them in Galactic Common, explained what was happening, and asked for their consent before touching them. The medics moved with a softness that proved impossible for the same species that had just torn a Grash warship apart like a storm. Aara was the last to board. She stopped at the entrance to the docking tube and looked back at the collector's prize. The ship that had been her prison, dark and broken against the stars. Then she looked at Asante, who stood by the tube in his armor, helmet under his arm, watching her with his quiet, kind eyes. "Sergeant Coffee," she said. "Yes, Captain?" "Thank you." She said it first in her own language, then in Galactic Common, and then she tried to say it in the human language she had heard the Marines use among themselves. She mispronounced it, but the intent was clear. "Thank you." Asante nodded. "You're welcome, Captain. Go get some rest. You've earned it." She turned and walked through the docking tube onto Mercy's hand, into warmth and light, into the hands of humans who would heal her. Behind her, the door closed, and the darkness of the Grash ship vanished. In the Achilles landing bay, the surviving Marines sat on their benches and began the long, slow process of recovering from the fight. They cleaned their armor piece by piece and stacked it neatly. They cleaned their weapons. They checked on each other, not necessarily with words, but with looks, nods, a hand on a shoulder. 3 empty benches, 3 sets of armor that would never be worn again, 3 Marines who had gone into the dark and not returned. Their names were added to a list that was already too long, and their friends sat in silence and remembered them. Asante sat on his bench and opened a photograph on his personal device. His wife Adoa and son Kwame, standing in front of their home in Accra on a warm day, smiling at the camera. Kwame was holding a soccer ball and smiling with the gap in the teeth of a 7-year-old who didn't know the galaxy was full of monsters. Asante stared at the photo for a long time, then closed it, put the device away, and went to write letters to the families of the 3 Marines who had died. That, too, was his job. All of it was his job. And outside the ship, in the cold silence of the Karad expanse, the debris of 7 Grash ships drifted among the stars. The collector's prize hung dark and unpowered, a hollow shell. The gentle Whisper was still attached to its captor by the docking clamps, beaten but whole. And the UEF battle group sat in the middle of it all. 5 small ships in a sea of debris, quiet and vigilant. The battle was over, but the war, the one that would be waged with words, politics, and the slow, grinding machine of galactic civilization was only beginning. The medical bay of UEF Mercy's hand was warm, clean, and smelled of disinfectant. After 3 days in the foul-smelling hold of the Grash slaver ship, Captain Aara thought it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. She lay on a bed that had been adjusted to her body, lowered, narrowed, with supports for her arms and a pillow shaped to accommodate the structure of the Wyland skull. The human doctor had examined her within minutes of arrival, running a portable scanner over her body with the focused calm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The doctor's name was Lieutenant Chen, no relation to the Marine colonel. She explained with a slight smile, and she treated Aara's cracked cheekbone, her swollen eye, her dehydration, and a dozen minor injuries she had received during captivity with a speed and competence that left Aara speechless. Your bone structure is similar to what we see in amphibian species on our home world, Lieutenant Chen said, applying a regeneration patch to Aara's cracked cheekbone. Not identical, but close enough that our standard bone recovery protocols worked with minor adjustments. You'll have to wear this patch for 48 hours. It will itch. Try not to scratch it. Aara looked at the doctor. You know how to treat Wyland injuries? We studied your species' medical literature during the transit here. Your government publishes very detailed physiological databases. Our xenobiology team spent 30 hours preparing treatment protocols. Chen paused and looked at her carefully, in a way that was simultaneously professional and benevolent. We wanted to be ready. They had prepared. They had spent hours they could have used for rest, for sleep, for preparing for battle, studying the biology of a species they had never treated before, developing medical protocols from scratch, adjusting their equipment for patients with 4 arms, different blood chemistry, and different bone density. They did it because they knew that when they arrived, there would be people needing help, and they intended to be able to provide it. Aara lay in bed and tried to understand what kind of species would do that. Around her, the medical bay was full of her crew. 37 Wylands, all receiving treatment. Some had physical injuries, fractures, cuts, bruises, signs of grash abuse. Others had no visible injuries, but sat in their beds with empty eyes and trembling hands, staring at the walls or the ceiling, locked in memories that didn't want to let them go. The human medics treated both kinds of wounds with the same seriousness. Physical injuries received medicine, patches, and, where necessary, surgery. Psychological injuries received quiet conversations, warm blankets, soft voices, and the simple, powerful comfort of someone who sat next to you and said, "You are not alone." Sulit lay in a bed next to Aara. The young comms officer hadn't said a word since the rescue. She lay on her side, curled into a small ball. Her arms were wrapped around herself. A human medic, a large bearded man named Officer Third Class Graves, whose hands were the size of dinner plates but whose voice was soft as cotton, sat on a chair next to her bed and talked to her. He didn't demand that she respond. He didn't force her to interact. He just sat there and talked in a slow, gentle galactic common about nothing in particular. He talked about his daughter on Earth, who was 5, and loved to draw horses. He told stories about how he once tried to cook a traditional Earth dish called lasagna in the ship's galley and triggered 3 fire alarms. He talked about the stars visible from the observation deck and how they looked different depending on where you were in the galaxy. Sulit didn't respond, but after an hour, her body relaxed slightly. After 2 hours, her eyes focused on Graves's face. After 3 hours, she whispered one word in Wyland, which the translator rendered as more. Graves smiled and kept talking. On the 4th day after the rescue, Commander Lena Vasquez arrived on Mercy's Hand to visit the Wyland crew. She came alone, without guards or assistants, in a clean uniform and with a data pad. She found Aara sitting on her bed, eating a bowl of nutrient paste that human doctors had developed to meet Wyland dietary needs. It wasn't like home, but it was warm, satisfying, and given freely, and that made it the best meal Aara had ever eaten. Vasquez pulled up a chair and sat next to the bed. For a moment, they both just looked at each other. 2 women from very different worlds. One tall, dark, and hardened by 20 years of military experience. The other small, blue, and quiet. A scientist who never expected to see the inside of a warship. "How are you feeling, Captain?" Vasquez asked. "Better," Aara said. "Your doctors are very skilled. They are the best we have. If anyone can fix your crew, it's Okoya's team." There was a pause. Aara set aside her spoon and looked at the human commander with the cautious, probing gaze of a scientist studying a specimen she didn't quite understand. "Commander Vasquez, I have to ask you something." "Ask." "Why did you come?" Vasquez blinked. She tilted her head slightly, as if the question didn't quite make sense. "You sent a distress signal. You were in danger." We responded. "Yes, but why?" "We sent that signal to everyone, to every species in range. We've confirmed that since. Our signal was received by 27 different civilizations. The Conclave received it. The Talar received it. The Rotans received it. All of them heard us. None of them came." Aara's voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "You are the smallest power in this region of space. You have been among the stars for less than 200 years. You have no treaty with the Wylands. You owe us nothing. You owe us nothing at all. And yet you sent a fleet. You risked the lives of your people. 3 of your soldiers died. She paused. Why? Vasquez was silent for a long time. She leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling of the medical bay, where the lamps hummed quietly behind the panels. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It became lower, less official, more personal. 2 years ago, a ship called the Stellan Hope was captured by the Grash. It was a colonial transport carrying civilians, families, children. By the time we got there, the ship was empty. Everything was gone. 216 people. We never found them. She looked at Aara. 47 of them were children. Aara said nothing. She saw the weight of those numbers in the human's eyes. A weight that hadn't diminished with time, which sat behind the commander's professional calm like a stone at the bottom of a river. After the Stellan Hope, we made a decision, Vasquez continued. Not a political decision, not a strategic decision, but a human decision. We decided that the next time someone called for help, we would be there. Period. No calculations, no committees, no jurisdictional analysis. Who's calling? We're coming. That is the law. That is the promise. The promise, Aara repeated. Yes. Order 71. We call it the promise. Vasquez's jaw tightened slightly. We named it that because promises mean something to us. Where we're from, if you say you'll be there, you're there. And if you fail, you don't make excuses. You make sure it doesn't happen again. She looked at Aara, and her dark eyes were fierce, tired, and something else, something that looked like grief and love twisted into something that didn't have a name. You asked why we came, Captain? I'll tell you. We came because you asked. That's it. That's the entire reason. You asked for help. We heard you, and we came. That is what we do. That is not what other species do. No, Vasquez said. It isn't. That is their problem. News of the rescue spread first slowly, then instantly. It started with the combat report that Commander Park submitted through standard UEF channels to Admiral T on Earth. The report was complete, professional, and classified. It was supposed to remain classified. It didn't. Someone, who was never officially identified, uploaded the full report to the Galactic Open Information Exchange, a public database that served as the galactic equivalent of a general library. The report included everything: the distress signal, the 27 species that received it, and the 0 that responded, the deployment of the UEF battle group, the engagement with the Grash fleet, the boarding operation, and the rescue of the Wyland crew. It included the names of the 3 fallen Marines. It included Captain Aara's testimony, data from her hospital bed on Mercy's hand, in which she described her captivity, the rescue, and Vasquez's answer to her question. The report went viral in the galactic information ecosystem, where data traveled faster than light through the relay networks connecting billions of worlds. The story of the gentle whisper spread like fire through dry grass. Within days, it had been read, translated, discussed, and debated on every major world in the quadrant. The reactions were varied and revealing. The Conclave of Enlightened Worlds reacted first, because the Conclave was always the first to react to anything that made them look bad. A Conclave representative issued a statement explaining that the Emergency Response Committee was actively considering the distress signal when the human intervention occurred, and that a response force would have been sent within the standard review period. When asked what the standard review period was, the representative said, 10 standard days. And when it was pointed out that the Wyland crew would almost certainly have been sold and scattered within 72 hours, the representative declined further comment. The Talarian hegemony issued a statement expressing deep satisfaction with the safe return of the Wyland crew and noting that their own diplomatic efforts had contributed to the broader environment of stability that made such operations possible. No one who knew the situation believed it. But the Telar didn't expect to be believed. They expected to be on the record. The Rotan Collective said nothing. They were very good at saying nothing. But the real response, the one that mattered, didn't come from the great powers, but from the small ones. Throughout the galaxy were hundreds of species similar to the Wylands. Small, peaceful, either technologically capable but militarily weak. They were scientists, artists, merchants, farmers, builders. They inhabited the gaps between the great empires, lived in spaces the powerful species didn't bother to occupy. They had always known on some level that they were vulnerable, that the great powers of the galaxy wouldn't protect them, that if something bad happened to them in the wrong place at the wrong time, they would be alone. They accepted it because there was no alternative. The Conclave was too slow. The Talar helped only when there was profit. The Rotans didn't care. There was no one to call. No one who would answer, no one who would come until now. The Polari, a species of small burrowing mammals living on 3 colonial worlds in the Outer Rim, sent a diplomatic delegation to the nearest human outpost. The delegation carried an official request for consultation on mutual defense. The Polari ambassador, a round, furry creature the size of a human child, presented the request with great ceremony, and then, in a moment not in the official program, asked the officer who accepted it, "Is it true? If we call, will you really come?" The officer, a young lieutenant who hadn't been instructed on how to answer this question, looked at the Polari ambassador and said, "Yes, sir, we will come." The Polari ambassador looked at the lieutenant for a long time, then very quietly began to purr. The lieutenant later learned that purring was an expression of deep relief for the Polari. The Detoni, an aquatic species living in pressurized environments on ocean worlds, sent a trade proposal to Earth. The Yongtha, a crystalline species communicating with light patterns, requested a cultural exchange program. The Malari, a species of winged beings that had lost 2 colonial ships to raiders over the last decade without any response from the galactic community, asked for military advisors to help train their self-defense forces. One by one, the small species of the galaxy began to turn their eyes toward humanity, not because humans were the strongest, the smartest, or the most advanced. They turned to humanity because humanity had done the one thing no other power in the galaxy wanted to do. They showed up. At the Conclave headquarters, in a building orbiting a star in the center of Conclave space, a classified internal memo was circulated among senior diplomatic staff. The memo was written by the Bureau of Strategic Assessment, the department responsible for evaluating long-term threats and opportunities. It was marked with the highest level of secrecy, which in practice meant it was leaked within a week. The memo was 17 pages long. It analyzed human military strength, human psychology, human social structures, human history, and human cultural patterns. It analyzed the rescue of the Gentle Whisper in detail and compared it to other human military operations, human disaster relief operations, and human behavioral patterns dating back centuries. It consulted xenopsychologists, military analysts, historians, and sociologists. The conclusion was contained in a single paragraph on the last page. The paragraph was later quoted in diplomatic briefings, academic papers, news reports, and arguments in bars across the galaxy. It read, "By the assessment of this Bureau, the primary strategic significance of the incident in the Karat Expanse lies not in the military, but in the psychological plane. Humanity's intervention demonstrates a behavioral model without parallel among known spacefaring species, an instinctive, non-traditional response to distress signals from non-allied entities. Analysis of human history and culture suggests this is not an anomaly, but a constant trait at the species level. Humans do not evaluate rescue operations based on strategic value, economic gain, or political advantage. They evaluate them based on necessity. Consequently, this Bureau concludes that humanity's greatest strategic asset is not their military strength, their capacity for aggression, or their death world physiology. It is that when someone cries for help, they actually come. The implications of this for the galactic balance of power, in the opinion of this Bureau, are profound and irreversible. Profound and irreversible. The memo was filed. Committees were formed. Subcommittees were assembled. The conclave would debate the implications for years. They would produce reports, hold conferences, draft resolutions. They would do what they always did, talk. Meanwhile, the small species of the galaxy continued to send their delegations to human space. They continued to ask their question, and the humans continued to give their answer. If you call, we will come. A few months after the rescue, Captain Aara returned to active service. Her cheekbone had healed, her eye had healed. The nightmares hadn't healed, and they probably never would. But she had learned to live alongside them, the way humans lived alongside the dangerous creatures of their home world, with respect, with caution, and by not letting them stop her from doing what needed to be done. She had learned this from the humans. She was assigned to a new ship, a Wyland research vessel called First Light, and she had specifically and repeatedly requested that her first mission be in partnership with a human escort ship. The Wyland government, still processing the diplomatic aftermath of the rescue, granted the request. The escort ship was the UEF Iron Promise, one of the Wolfpack destroyers that had fought in the Karat Expanse. Its captain, Commander Lieutenant Aisha Roman, met Aara at the docking port when First Light arrived at the rendezvous point. Roman was younger than Aara had expected, barely 30 years old, with sharp eyes, a quick smile, and hands that moved with the nervous energy of someone who was always thinking 3 steps ahead. "Captain Aara," Roman said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "It is an honor to meet you." Aara took her hand. She had practiced this gesture. "The honor is mine, Commander. You fought to save my crew." "We all fought, Captain. It's the job." They stood for a moment. 2 women from 2 very different worlds, linked by an event that changed the course of galactic history. Then Roman smiled, a bright, fierce, slightly wild smile that made her look even younger. "Well then," she said. "Where are we going?" Aara smiled back. It was the first real smile she had managed to summon since the gentle whisper was captured. "Into the deep. There are things out there worth studying, Commander. And this time, I intend to come home." "You'll come home," Roman said. "I guarantee it." Aara believed her, because humans made promises, and humans kept them. It was the simplest thing in the galaxy, and the rarest, and the most powerful. Far away, at Anchor Station Thermopylae, Commander Lena Vasquez sat in her office and worked through the mountain of paperwork that the rescue had generated. Reports to file, awards to write, requests to submit, diplomatic queries to answer. The galaxy was asking questions, and someone had to provide the answers, and that someone obviously was her. She finished the last report at 0200. With a tired hand, she signed it and sent it off. Then she stood, stretched her back, and walked to the small observation window in her office. The stars were bright, cold, and infinite, as always. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was changing slowly, clumsily, as galaxies always change, not through grand declarations or dramatic turning points, but through small actions accumulated over time that gradually shifted the balance of the possible and the expected. One rescue, one fleet, one kept promise. It wasn't enough to change everything. It was enough to start. Vasquez poured herself a cup of recycled coffee, still terrible, still the only coffee available, and took a sip. She set the cup down and looked at the stars once more, then returned to work. Somewhere out there in the dark, another signal was already traveling, a faint voice calling from nowhere, asking, "Is there anyone there? Can anyone hear? Will anyone come?" And on Anchor Station Thermopylae, on Outpost Echo, 7, on observation posts and relay stations scattered across the edge of human space, the receivers were on. Someone was always listening, and when the call came when it came, not if the answer would be the same answer that had been there ever since the first human reached into the dark.